The screams of Rome never ceased. But that night, they were different. As firelight danced across the palatial walls of Domus Aurea and laughter echoed from drunken halls, an eerie silence shrouded the imperial bedchambers. There, under velvet drapes and flickering torchlight, the emperor's gaze was fixed on a boy delicate, frightened, and barely old enough to understand the twisted love of an empire's most dangerous man. This was not politics. This was obsession, and it would end in blood. Rome in the 1st century AD was a city of spectacle, decadence, and absolute power. At its heart stood Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Rome's 5th emperor, adopted by his great-uncle Claudius and groomed for rule by one of the most dangerous women in Roman history, Agrippina the Younger. From his earliest days, Nero's life was not his own. He was molded by forces far more cunning and cruel than even he would later become. But Nero did not remain a pawn. He learned quickly and wielded his lessons with theatrical brutality. By the time Nero reached his late teens, he had already demonstrated the volatility that would define his reign. He was charming, cultured, a lover of music and theater. He could make the people adore him. But beneath the finely tuned performance was a soul unraveling. Nero craved adoration, submission, beauty, but above all, control, especially when it came to those closest to him. Among them was a woman who would seal her fate with one well-placed slap, Poppaea Sabina. Described by Roman historians as stunningly beautiful and ruthlessly ambitious, Poppaea knew how to climb in a court ruled by manipulation. She seduced her way to Nero's side, pushing aside his first wife, Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, with whispers and charm. Octavia was noble but cold. Poppaea was warm, attentive, dangerous. Once she was empress, Poppaea's influence grew rapidly. She did not merely love Nero, she intoxicated him. Their marriage, however, would be a fragile dance of affection and violence. In 65 AD, as she carried Nero's unborn child, an argument between them turned savage. Poppaea, either by a brutal kick or a reckless outburst, died at Nero's hand. The sources vary, but the result remains chilling. She was gone, and with her went the last thread of Nero's sanity. What followed was not mourning, it was madness. Nero wept publicly, lavished funerary honors upon her, and declared her divine. He ordered her embalmed in spices and buried with imperial grandeur. But something darker stirred behind the veil of grief. Nero had not just lost a wife. He had lost the embodiment of his ideal beauty, submission, allure. And in his twisted psyche, she had to be replaced. That's when the boy entered the story. His name was Sporus, a young slave or page, barely into adolescence, with soft features and an uncanny resemblance to the empress who now lay dead beneath Rome's soil. His exact origins remain unclear, but Roman historians agree on what came next. Nero took the boy, castrated him, dressed him in silks, called him Poppaea, and married him in a mock imperial wedding. With great pomp, he declared Sporus his wife. The Roman elite recoiled. Even in a city that had witnessed emperors marry horses and host gladiator games in private gardens, this act crossed a threshold of horror. But Nero didn't care. The boy followed him everywhere on public appearances, state visits, even in Greece, where Nero fancied himself a godlike performer before the crowds of the East. To many, Sporus was a symbol of imperial depravity. To Nero, he was resurrection, a grotesque reincarnation of his greatest loss. But how had Rome arrived at a place where a boy could be mutilated and crowned as an empress? To understand this, we must look deeper not only at Nero, but at the very world that raised him. A world of poisoned chalices, secret murders, and whispered promises. A world where the line between love and violence, power and possession, was blurred beyond recognition. In the next part, we will return to the early years of Nero's reign, his rise to power, the chilling mentorship of Agrippina, and the slow transformation from golden boy to tyrant. This is not just a story of a man and a boy, it is the tale of Rome at its most beautiful, its most terrifying, and its most human. Nero did not begin as a monster. He was born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, the only son of Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus and Agrippina the Younger. His mother's sister of the infamous Emperor Caligula and great-granddaughter of Augustus himself, was a woman of extraordinary lineage, ambition, and cunning. When Nero was just 3, his father died, and Agrippina set her sights higher. She would make her son the emperor of Rome, no matter the cost. In 49 AD, Agrippina married her uncle, Emperor Claudius, an act that shocked even the decadent Roman elite. She convinced him to adopt her son, now renamed Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, and systematically eliminated rivals, including Claudius's own son, Britannicus. By the age of 16, Nero was proclaimed heir. At 17, he became emperor when Claudius died suddenly after a suspicious plate of mushrooms. Most sources agree. Agrippina had orchestrated her husband's death. The throne was now Nero's, and behind it, Agrippina pulled the strings. At first, Nero's reign was seen as promising. Under the guidance of philosopher Seneca and the wise prefect Burrus, the empire was well managed. Taxes were fair, public games were generous. The people were content. But the young emperor was restless. He was not a soldier. He was not a statesman. Nero was a performer. He longed for the stage, not the Senate. And as the months passed, he chafed under the control of his mother and advisors. Agrippina, in particular, clung to her influence, appearing at official functions and even on coinage beside her son, an affront to Roman tradition. Nero began to resist. He took a mistress, the freedwoman Acte, whom Agrippina loathed. He surrounded himself with flatterers and artists. He grew increasingly paranoid, increasingly indulgent. His mother, realizing she was losing her grip, made a desperate play. She attempted to back Britannicus, the son of Claudius, as emperor instead. Nero responded decisively. At a banquet, Britannicus drank poisoned wine. Within moments, he was dead just days before his 14th birthday. The crowd gasped. Nero claimed the boy had suffered a seizure, but everyone knew. With Britannicus gone, Agrippina's power waned, but she remained a threat. She began spreading rumors, threatening to reveal secrets. She had made Nero emperor. She could unmake him. And so, in 59 AD, Nero made the most chilling decision of his young reign. He would kill his own mother. He tried subtlety first. Poisoned food. A collapsing ceiling. Nothing worked. Agrippina was too careful. Then came the infamous boat plot. Nero had a collapsible vessel built and invited his mother to stay aboard for a peaceful journey down the coast. Once at sea, the boat was designed to fall apart, drowning her. But Agrippina survived swimming to shore in full view of onlookers, battered but alive. Now exposed, Nero resorted to brute force. Soldiers were sent to her villa in the middle of the night. They stabbed her in her bedchamber. According to some accounts, she died screaming, "Smite my womb," a final cry of bitter defiance. The death of Agrippina marked a turning point. With no one left to restrain him, Nero's descent accelerated. He divorced and exiled his first wife, Octavia, accusing her falsely of adultery. When the people protested, he had her executed. Then came Poppaea Sabina, ambitious, alluring, and dangerous. Poppaea was not content to be mistress. She wanted the crown, and Nero, enamored by her beauty and submission, gave it to her. With Octavia gone, he married Poppaea, elevating her to empress. But Poppaea's power was built on volatile ground. Nero was increasingly unstable, tormented by hallucinations, nightmares, and compulsive guilt. He would pace the halls at night, talking to the shadows. His love, like his rage, was unpredictable. In 65 AD, as Poppaea lay pregnant with what could have been the future heir of Rome, She said something that displeased Nero. The records do not agree on what it was, but they agree on the consequence. In a fit of fury, he kicked her in the abdomen. The child died. So did Poppaea. Now alone, Nero did not grieve like a man. He grieved like a god wounded. He honored her as divine, built statues and decreed festivals in her name. But these gestures were not enough. The emptiness inside him demanded more. Then he saw Sporus. Some historians suggest Nero had noticed the boy before, perhaps in the imperial court or among the household slaves. Sporus was gentle, delicate-featured, with large eyes and soft skin. To Nero, he was not a boy. He was Poppaea-born. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing act of his reign. Nero ordered the boy castrated. He dressed him in the empress's clothing, gave him her jewelry, and even used her cosmetics. He called him my wife, and paraded him before the court as if Poppaea had never died. The wedding was public, conducted with full imperial ceremony. Sporus, clad in gold-embroidered silk, was led through the halls by attendants, veiled, and given away like a bride. Nero played the groom. They shared a home. They traveled together, the emperor and his eunuch queen. To the Roman Senate and aristocracy, it was an outrage, but no one dared challenge Nero openly. By this time, he had executed hundreds, including senators, poets, generals, and even members of his own family. His secret police prowled the streets. Whispers of disloyalty were enough to trigger arrests. Torture chambers beneath the Palatine Hill worked day and night. Sporus became a symbol not only of Nero's madness, but of Rome's helplessness. Even the gods, it seemed, had abandoned them. By the late 60s AD, the mask had fallen completely from Nero's face. The once promising emperor-cultured, artistic generoshad transformed into something far more terrifying. A man convinced of his divinity, hungry for applause, and immune to shame. Rome was no longer a republic in decay. It had become a theater of madness, and Nero was its star. The imperial court pulsed with spectacle. Nero commissioned vast gardens for nightly feasts, where guests reclined beneath artificial stars as peacocks strutted through pools of wine. Sporus, in silk and perfume, was now a regular sight greeting guests, seated beside Nero on a golden throne, hailed as Augusta by trembling senators. He played the part well, but those who looked closely saw the truth. The boy was hollowed by fear. His body may have been transformed, but his eyes remained the eyes of a slave, staring through layers of pain and forced affection. Still, Nero demanded admiration. And not just for his conquest, she wanted to be adored as an artist. He fancied himself a poet, a charioteer, and most of all, an actor. Against the wishes of his advisors, he took to the stage, scandalizing Roman nobles who believed public performance was beneath an emperor. But Nero did not care. In fact, the more scandalized they became, the more he performed. In private theaters and then public amphitheaters, Nero played Greek tragic heroes. He wept, he sang, he died dramatically again and again to thunderous, orchestrated applause. Audiences were forced to watch for hours, forbidden to leave. Pregnant women fainted. Elders collapsed in heat. But none dared move until the emperor dropped his final tear or bowed low in costume before his enslaved empress boy. Sporus, meanwhile, was always nearby, at Nero's side in chariot races, by his feet during recitals. There were whisper-shushed and horrified about what happened behind closed doors. Some said Nero reenacted scenes from Poppaea's life with Sporus playing her part. Others claimed he forced Sporus to mimic her voice, her gestures, her expressions. There are even accounts suggesting Nero referred to him as Lady Sabina during moments of intimacy. But the madness wasn't confined to palace walls. In 64 AD, disaster struck Rome in the most literal sense. Fire. The Great Fire of Rome began on the night of the 18th of July. For 6 days the city burned. Entire district homes, Temples, markets were reduced to ash. Thousands were left homeless. Ancient relics were lost forever. Amid the inferno, rumors flared like sparks. Nero had started it. The claim, though unproven, gained traction. People whispered that Nero wanted to clear land to build his grand palace at the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. When questioned, Nero blamed the Christians, a new and mysterious religious group seen as enemies of Roman gods. He rounded them up by the hundreds, crucified them, burned them alive, and even had some sewn into animal skins to be torn apart by dogs in front of screaming crowds. But the rumors stuck. The people remembered. When the city was burning, Nero was performing. Some say he stood on a tower, watching the flames and singing of Troy's destruction as Sporus held his lyre. Whether myth or fact, it became the symbol of his rule. Rome in flames, Nero in costume. Still, he pressed forward with his vision. He began construction of the Domus Aurea, an opulent wonder of the ancient world. It had artificial lakes, rotating dining rooms, walls encrusted with pearls and ivory, and in the heart of it, a colossal statue of himself as the sun god. Sporus resided in the palace too, no longer a servant, but not quite free, his identity now absorbed into the emperor's obsession. But Nero's love of grandeur came at a cost. The treasury was drained, taxes soared, grain supplies faltered, riots broke out in provinces, plots emerged from every corner of the empire. One by one, Nero responded with violence. His once beloved tutor Seneca was forced to slit his wrists. Generals were executed. Entire noble families were wiped out. His paranoia had become bottomless. By 67 AD, Nero had become so disconnected from reality that he embarked on a tour of Greece and to make war, not to govern but to perform. He entered every artistic competition, singing, acting, racing chariots. Predictably, he won them either through bribes or brute force. He returned to Rome not with spoils of conquest, but with 1,800 trophies for musical performance. Sporus was with him during this time, dressed as empress, surrounded by whispers and stares. Some accounts say the boy began to withdraw even more, barely speaking unless prompted, following orders with mechanical obedience. He had been taken from childhood, mutilated, renamed, adored, humiliated, and now lived as a reflection of a dead woman inside a madman's fantasy. But Nero's stage was shrinking. The people had grown weary. The military was disillusioned. And far away, in distant provinces, powerful men were preparing to rise. By the year 68 AD, Nero's empire was unraveling faster than his grasp on reality. His theatrical self-deification, his obsession with music, luxury, and the illusion of love had not only exhausted Rome's coffers, but had bled its soul. The generals no longer cheered. The Senate no longer obeyed. The people no longer feared. And from the corners of the empire, rebellion rose like storm clouds. In Gaul, the powerful governor Gaius Julius Vindex declared open revolt. His message was blunt. Rome deserved better than a man who fancied himself Apollo while his people starved. In Hispania, another governor, Servius Sulpicius Galba, joined the cause. Galba was a veteran, seasoned and stoic, everything Nero was not. His troops declared him imperator, the new emperor of Rome. Panic struck Nero like a stage curtain collapsing mid-performance. He called for executions, pleaded with the Senate, summoned loyal legions only to discover that loyalty was no longer his currency. The Praetorian Guard, once the shield of emperors, abandoned him. Bribed by Galba's promises and exhausted by Nero's absurdity, they refused to protect their sovereign. Alone in the crumbling Domus Aurea, Nero wandered through its golden halls. His colossus stood tall, but the world it had watched over was crumbling. The boy Sporus followed closely behind, dressed as always in bridal silks, his face painted in quiet dread. Nero wept, raged, and tried to rally the few courtiers left to him. But none would stand beside him when the end came. It was in these final hours that we catch a last, haunting glimpse of the strange bond between the emperor and the boy who bore the name Poppaea. Nero, it is said, entertained one final fantasy. He would flee Rome, gather troops in the east, and return in triumph not as emperor, but as an artist, an actor who would win back his empire with poetry and performance. Even now, he whispered, men will weep to see me die. But his words rang hollow. The Senate declared him a public enemy, punishable by torture and death. The once golden boy of Rome was now its most hated man. With no options left, Nero fled to the villa of a freedman, Phaon, outside the city. It was a place of shadows and silence, far from the noise of imperial Rome. Sporus went with him, not as an empress now, but as a final witness. The hours dragged as news filtered in, the Senate's death sentence, the soldiers en route, the end. Nero paced wildly, clutching a dagger, begging someone he knew to take his life. Have I neither friend nor foe? He cried. But none among his shrinking entourage would lift a hand. At last he was alone with only one true mirror, himself. In a moment of collapse, as hooves approached in the distance, Nero pressed the dagger to his throat. His hand trembled. It was not courage that had carried him all these years, but theater. And death was no performance. According to Suetonius, it was his secretary Epaphroditus who helped drive the blade in. With blood gushing from his neck, Nero gasped his last. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. He was 30 years old. His body was unceremoniously buried in a modest tomb on the Pincian Hill. The Domus Aurea was stripped, his statues toppled, his name cursed. The Senate rushed to erase him from memory, branding him a tyrant, a monster, a shame. But one figure remained uncursed, unacknowledged, left adrift in the wreckage. Sporus. What became of the boy? The history, though fragmented, does not end there. After Nero's death, the court scattered. The empire reeled as generals claimed the throne in brutal succession. Galba ruled briefly before being murdered. Otho followed, and then Vitellius, and then Vespasian, each man clawing power from the ashes of Nero's empire. And through all of this, Sporus remained, a boy who had once been a slave, then an empress, then a fugitive, now passed from hand to hand, like a relic of imperial shame. Otho, who had once been married to the real Poppaea before Nero stole her away, took custody of Sporus. Some believe it was affection. Others suspect political theatrical mockery of Nero's grotesque union. After Otho's suicide, Sporus drifted again, caught in the cruel tide of Rome's civil wars. Eventually, he came under the control of Nymphidius Sabinus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Like Nero before him, Nymphidius fell in love, or at least in lust, with the delicate boy. He too began calling Sporus his bride. Plans were made for yet another wedding. Once more, Sporus was to be paraded as an empress, this time not for an emperor, but a usurper. But Sporus had tasted enough of Roman love. Rather than endure another spectacle, he took his own life. A blade or poison, no one is certain. What is certain is this: he died not as a slave, not as an empress, not even as Sporus. He died as a boy whose identity had been devoured by the whims of power. He was perhaps 15, or maybe 16. In the months following Nero's death, Rome convulsed. The year of the 4 emperors unfolded like a bloody farce. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, each ascending through betrayal, each falling in blood. But even amidst this chaos, one theme endured in whispers and graffiti: Nero. The people oddly remembered him with mixed emotions. Though the Senate had damned his name and condemned his reign as tyrannical, the urban poor, especially in Rome, mourned the games, festivals, and bread he had once lavished upon them. Decades later, impostors would rise across the empire claiming to be the resurrected Nero. In Parthia, One such pretender even garnered enough support to trouble Roman diplomats. The myth of Nero, artist-emperor, lived on grotesque and seductive. But what of Sporus? History, as recorded by Rome's patriarchal elite, left him little more than a footnote. In the works of Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus, he appears fleetingly always in relation to Nero, never as a person, never with a voice. He is simply the boy, the eunuch, the wife of the emperor. But even these passing mentions reveal a staggering truth. Sporus was not forgotten because of his insignificance. He was remembered because his very existence disturbed the moral order of the Roman world. To castrate a boy and parade him as an empress was not only a violation of personal autonomy, it was a desecration of Roman masculinity, lineage, and tradition. The Roman ideal of virtus manliness, honor, dignity, was shattered by Sporus's presence at court. He embodied a perversion of empire, beauty without consent, power without identity, love without humanity. And yet, he endured. Roman society, so fond of categorization, had no place for someone like Sporus. He was not a woman, yet was dressed as one. He was not free, yet treated as royalty. He was not a performer, yet became the centerpiece of a theater of cruelty. His identity was not fluid, it was stolen, rewritten again and again by the whims of powerful men. He was a puppet, a shadow cast by the desires of emperors. And yet, in that shadow, we find one of the few glimpses of truth in Nero's golden fantasy. For all his cruelty and madness, Nero did not seek Sporus as a political pawn. He sought him out of grief, obsession, and a twisted hunger for control. In a world where emperors arranged marriages for alliance and killed to maintain legacy, Nero did something more deranged. He tried to resurrect the dead. Sporus was not just a replacement for Poppaea. He was Poppaea's Nero wished her to be. Silent, submissive, eternal. It is telling that Sporus never ran, never betrayed Nero, never publicly protested. Whether out of trauma, indoctrination, or sheer survival instinct, he remained close until the very end. But after Nero's death, when freedom might have offered redemption, Sporus discovered that he had no place to go. Every man who claimed him Otho Nymphidius Sabinusa him not as a person but as a relic of power. They were not rescuers. They were captors in a different mask. The ancient sources never tell us Sporus's real name. We do not know where he was born. We do not know what he believed, what he feared, what he longed for. We only know how others used him. That erasure is, in itself, a form of violence. What is clear, however, is that Sporus's story exposes the grotesque underbelly of Imperial Romano in its wars or taxes, but in its human cost. Rome was built on blood and spectacle, on domination disguised as divinity. In Nero's relationship with Sporus, we find the purest expression of that rot. The emperor who burned his city and crowned a castrated boy in the ashes. Centuries later, Christian chroniclers would interpret Nero as the Antichrist. His name, numerologically rendered as 666 in some texts, became a cipher for ultimate evil. But the Christians, too, ignored Sporus. They saw the emperor's sin but not its victim. Only in modern retellings through psychology, ethics, and a greater awareness of power dynamics do we begin to see Sporus not just as a symbol, but as a person. A child whose body became an altar for another man's mourning. A victim of trauma whose memory has outlived empires. In the flickering torchlight of history, some stories are too strange, too sorrowful, too cruel to fade quietly. The tale of Nero and Sporus is one such story, a grotesque love letter written in blood, set against the decline of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. It is the kind of story we tell ourselves in whispers, as a caution or as a mirror. What did it mean, this union between a mad emperor and a castrated boy? To Rome, it was an embarrassment, a scandal to be downplayed. The Senateso, eager to forget Nero, treated Sporus as an artifact of shame, a freakish ornament of a reign gone mad. To historians, it was a tragic curiosity, often reduced to footnotes, shrugged off as one more example of imperial depravity. But for us, with the distance of centuries and the insight of modern empathy, the story speaks volumes. It tells us what power does when left unchecked, what grief becomes when twisted into ownership, what trauma looks like when inflicted not just on a body, but on a soul. Sporus was, in the end, not a character in his own story. He was a projection, a vessel for Nero's broken heart and dark fantasies. And yet, his silence across the annals of time speaks louder than any recorded speech. In that silence lies an accusation not just against Nero, but against every empire, every ruler, every system that prizes power over personhood. And Nero? What do we make of the man who burned cities and composed songs, who kicked his wife to death and mourned her so deeply he tried to resurrect her in another body? He was a man consumed not only by his own ego, but by his terror of loss. He sought immortality through art, love through domination, legacy through spectacle. But in the end, he achieved none of it. His name was cursed, his empire usurped, his memory twisted into myth. Yet even now, Nero refuses to vanish. He reappears in paintings, operas, films portrayed as a devil, a clown, a tragic artist. But always, always he overshadows the one who bled most from his madness. Sporus deserves more than silence, more than spectacle. He deserves remembrance. He was a child born into slavery, robbed of choice, of body, of name. He endured under a regime that celebrated cruelty as strength and submission as beauty. He was made into a wife, then a widow, then a trophy. And finally, when faced with the prospect of being used yet again, of being paraded like a ghost of Poppaea through the ambitions of another man, he chose to die on his own terms. In a world that gave him no freedom, it was the only act of autonomy left. And what of us? Today, what should we take from this story? We live in a world still haunted by versions of Neroman and systems that dress their obsession in robes of love, that cloak control in the language of affection. We still witness how trauma can be masked by ritual, how beauty can be forged through violence, how even mourning can become a weapon when wielded by power. History, if it has any purpose, is to warn. But history can also offer something else: recognition, to name what was done, to see the unseen, to speak for the silenced. So let us end not with Nero's final gasp, but with Sporus's final choice. A boy who, when stripped of everything, his gender, his freedom, his past, still found the will to say, no more. He did not cry out in rebellion. He did not speak vengeance. He simply refused to be paraded one more time through another man's fantasy. And in that moment, he stepped out of Nero's shadow, not into history's light, but into something even more powerful, a dignity denied him in life, but restored in remembrance. If you found this story as unsettling as it is illuminating, let it sit with you. Let it stir your thoughts. And if you wish, share your reflections. What does this story say about grief, power, identity, or the stories we choose to preserve? Thank you for staying through this tale of love without consent, power without mercy, and a boy whose name still echoes through the ruins of empire.